So next is Yash Joshi. He is entering his second year in the Integrated Science program at McMaster University, concentrating in psychology, neuroscience, and behavior. Yash has a strong interest in psychology and scientific research, and hopes to work in those respective fields in the future. He grew up in Toronto and now lives in Brampton, Ontario. He's a sports fan who loves soccer, basketball, baseball, and his favorite teams are the Raptors and the Blue Jays. Whenever he gets a chance, he enjoys road tripping and hiking. Here he is discussing gambling addictions and the COVID-19 pandemic. Take it away.
So hi everybody, my name is Yash, and today I'll be sharing some of the findings I found on the correlation between gambling addictions and the COVID-19 pandemic. So during a recent article writing phase with the AIC, I had the opportunity to explore some topics that I was passionate about. Sports are something that I've always loved, and one major aspect of them has always been betting. I got interested in this topic a while ago and decided to look into how the gambling industry specifically and how those suffering from gambling addictions were impacted by the pandemic. So at one point, even I considered gambling, so I was determined to see how the pandemic and the lockdowns specifically have been pushing people like me towards these risk-taking activities. The method I chose for this task was a literature review that compiles and investigates literary sources related to gambling, addictions, and the COVID-19 pandemic. So although most people might already know what gambling is, it is important to realize that even though it's an extremely popular activity amongst adults, people love to just go down to the casino or even hop online to make some money or just experience the thrill of it. The high-risk experience of gambling is what attracts most people, but the losses from it hurt just as much. The slight chance of large rewards is what makes this a highly addictive activity. While places like Las Vegas were major hotspots for gamblers, and since things are opening up are becoming even more popular, the pandemic forced many operations to shift online. There was a visible surge in online gaming and betting, but it's important to understand why that is. Addictions related to gambling are associated with neurotransmitters, specifically dopamine. Dopamine is released when an individual indulges in enjoyable activities such as eating, drinking, sex, and drugs. Great amounts of dopamine result in large feeling of pleasure. In fact, some researchers believe that gambling is an activity that some people resort to replace the lack of satisfaction, in their lives. As a part of the brain related to addictions, the thalamus plays a significant role through a concept known as loss aversion. The location of the thalamus in the brain can be seen on the diagram on the right. Loss aversion itself describes a person's tendency to avoid losses and choose gains, and it's directly related to norepinephrine levels. An example would be if someone's buying ice cream at a store. One store has it for $1, while the other store has the exact same ice cream for $100. The loss aversion parameters would make the individual realize that going for the $1 ice cream is going to save them money and avoid losses. Hence, why they would choose that. Also, norepinephrine is a hormone and a neurotransmitter. Studies have shown that heightened levels of norepinephrine in pathological gamblers impact the neurotransmitter's binding potential within the thalamus, consequently reducing loss aversion parameters. Although the process is not yet fully understood, it's highly believed that the excess norepinephrine affects how well they could bind in the area, and thus somehow decreases the loss aversion parameters within a person. The loss of these parameters then makes the individual extremely vulnerable to losing money, as they would see nothing wrong with it, hence continuing gambling in hopes to eventually win. There are also many other factors related to gambling addictions, with many having studies specifically looking at the correlation, such as genetic factors. But I won't be getting into that today. Now for the pandemic. The onset of the pandemic brought forth financial uncertainty for many people around the world. It is believed that this uncertainty led to large amounts of problem gambling. Problem gambling is a specific type of gambling which stems from financial and mental health problems and existed way beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. It was highlighted during many national and international financial crises. Problem gambling is a concern because vulnerable populations become a victim to the gambling industry. It's important to note that online gambling had been gaining traction even prior to the pandemic. Availability and ease are some of the major factors that entice players to go online compared to traditional mediums such as a casino. Many homes have devices and access to internet, solely decreasing the need for in-person venues. While people have varying opinions on gambling, even if it's online gambling can become a health hazard when combined with mental health concerns such as anxiety, depression, and psychosocial stress. Now let's look at the statistics of gambling while the pandemic was occurring. In a survey of 2005 gamblers, over half of them had reported that they had gambled online during the emergency lockdown measures in Ontario, Canada during 2020. Specific details of the gambling were not recorded, as the various categories were included under a general term. As the lockdowns matured, there seemed to be an increase in online card and slot games, highlighting the gradual shift to the online medium. As for demographics, it was noted that males were more likely to gamble online compared to females, although no specific reasoning was provided as to why this may be. There were also contrasting reports to this, which said that females were more likely to gamble than males. In other stats, younger adults aged 18 to 24 were also seen to be more commonly gambling than those in older groups, as seen on the diagram on the right. An increased number of younger gamblers can be related to the closure of many service sector jobs, which are often worked by younger adults to pay bills and possibly pay for school too. Gambling might have been the way for them to deal with the financial uncertainty they faced during the pandemic. Although slow, the number of active gamblers on gambling platforms increased between January and May 2020, as seen on the diagram on the top right. Exact numbers are not shown on the diagram, it's merely representation of the growth over time. The gambling industry already had a high number of players, and it seemed like the pandemic led to an even further increase. Furthermore, the average daily bet amount was also higher in May, around $7 per day per bet, signaling the increased desire for people to take a higher risk. Even though $7 might not seem like a large amount, it is higher than during pre-pandemic times at some venues. The data shown was collected from Canadian studies and sources, but similar trends were seen all around the world and in other gambling industries. While the frequency for online gambling may not have necessarily increased, those who bet on sports continued to bet on sports, with whatever limited options they had at the time. The lack of options had avid sports gamblers taking chances on sports they were not used to, in leagues they were not used to, and sports happening in countries they did not even know about, creating the potential for major losses. Even with the global pandemic occurring, those who had and still have a gambling addiction continue to find ways to fulfill the tasks they desire, which signals many problems. While financial concerns were and still continue to be the driving force for those gambling during the COVID-19 pandemic, many mental health concerns have also been brought forward. In individuals who are suffering from a gambling disorder, it was seen that in the first few weeks of the lockdown, many were concerned about the risk of infection and work. These concerns would clearly leave people in a vulnerable state. As for gambling habits, after the first 2 weeks of confinement and the lockdowns, 12% reported worse gambling, 19% were abstinent, 46% showed signs of anxiety, and 27% of those surveyed showed signs of depression. The diagrams give a perspective as to how gamblers were affected with respect to other gamblers. The other category is an umbrella term for numerous other options for which data was not provided. For example, in the diagram on the left, the other includes no change to gambling and slightly less gambling. Also, at a later checkpoint, 57% of respondents had mild to severe anxiety issues, while 56% had symptoms of depression ranging from mild to severe. The cases of severe anxiety and depression were rare, with mild being the most common response. The relation between the lockdowns, gambling, and these conditions is pretty evident, as oftentimes many people were unable to get the support they needed. A third of those gambling shared how they also dealt with some sort of mental health issue before the pandemic, with it getting amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to these issues, substance abuse often follows these type of mental health concerns and gambling addictions. Of a group of gamblers surveyed, the majority reported alcohol use in the initial 6 weeks of the lockdown, with 40% reporting increased consumption and about half reporting increased cannabis use. In both diagrams, the other represents a variety of options as decreased usage or no change for which specific data was not provided. While all alcohol and cannabis use is not hazardous, when substances are consumed in the situations that people are and some currently are in, their effects become amplified. These can lead to further risk-taking behavior amongst individuals. Overall, it can be seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought forth many issues in the lives of people everywhere. Lockdowns, financial uncertainty, and mental health concerns have made people vulnerable to gambling. Many are now getting introduced to the addictive nature of casinos and sports betting, whereas those already struggling with addiction prior to the pandemic have found themselves struggling again. While not all gambling is bad, it typically leads to negative impacts on the lives of many, giving them an addiction that they truly do not need. I personally feel that gambling is a topic that needs to be discussed more and even raised awareness about, because many are just unaware of the possible harms. The pandemic did not make things easy for individuals, yet I believe that further research can help mitigate the damage that the pandemic will leave on those with a gambling habit. That brings me to the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yash. That was great. Okay, so Kian's question for Yash is, do you think the fact that the pandemic has highlighted unknown addictions for so many people, it will make it easier for them to get help or get help sooner than they would normally have?
That's a good question. So I've actually had a conversation with this about this with a professor recently, and what his thoughts on it were that it will make it easier for people to get the help they need, but he also there's also a belief that the support system will be overwhelmed with all the incoming people that need the support and need the help with their addictions and with mental health concerns. So I feel like it might become easier for people to reach out, but then whether or not they get the adequate support that they need, that is to be unknown. No one knows that yet.
Yeah, that's always the struggle with anything mental health is, do we have the resources? So thank you very much for your answer there.
Yash, I have one more for you. The answer may seem on the face obvious, but so now that we're seeing a little bit of a decrease in the lockdowns, things are starting to open back up. Do we think that the amount of gamblers and people turning to it to gambling will decrease? And I think I'm especially wondering the people who started to or increased their gambling habits during the pandemic. Do we expect that changing the lockdowns will help to decrease their gambling, or do we think that there's going to need to be some more active interventions now that they have started on these gambling habits?
With that, a lot of like researchers in the field and experts, they do believe that it will decrease because for the most part, people that got involved during the pandemic, one, it was due to financial uncertainty, and then two, a lot of it was due to boredom because there's nothing else to do. With these lockdowns opening up, people are going to realize that there's no point in me just wasting my money there and losing stuff because a lot of people that joined in recently, they don't exactly know how to have major profits because they aren't that accustomed to the trends and all that in the industry. So a lot of experts do feel that it will go down. It might take a while, like with the lockdowns opening up, but it eventually will go down and it might just be back to people that were used to it before the pandemic. And that's what most people do believe, that it will go down eventually.
Okay, thank you.